Well, tēnā koe, Matt, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Greetings, everybody. Apologies that I can't be with you there today. Nothing I like more than a good trip to Hamilton, but unfortunately, under the level 2 situation that we've found ourselves in, I'm required back here in Wellington and have to join you in this virtual format. Thanks to the organisers of the conference for the opportunity to have a chat today. As Matt indicated, I'll say a few things by way of introduction, and then very happy to take questions. I'm conscious that it's a very informed audience, and so much of what I would run through in terms of facts and figures and so on, you'll all have at your fingertips. So what I thought I'd do is essentially talk about three things. Firstly, how we got to where we are now at this point in COVID and in our response to COVID. And I do want to just rehearse a little bit about our motivations around what we did do in response to COVID and how that's been borne out and some of the economic outcomes of that. I then secondly want to talk a little bit about the nature of a recovery and a rebuild, and again, our thinking around what that should look like. And then thirdly, just to touch on what are some of the long-standing challenges of the New Zealand economy that either haven't changed or have been brought into sharp relief by the effects of COVID-19. So I'll try and do that in the next few minutes. And I think when I look at the way in which we responded to COVID-19, quite clearly, the cliche that there's no playbook for dealing with a pandemic is absolutely true. This arrived on our shores in New Zealand just over a year ago, and it's been a massive year, and one in which we've had to rely on the advice of experts and ensure that we had a plan and a plan that we stuck to in terms of how to deal with COVID. But when we thought about, well, what were the policy responses within that, that's when you are working a lot off instinct and off principle. When it came to the way we viewed it, we very much viewed it through the lens of our wellbeing approach. And as all of you will know, that's the approach we've taken to the way we're constructing budgets and the way we're looking to both decide what we spend money on, but also how we measure our success, looking at a wider range of indicators than perhaps we might have traditionally done. That is based, in the case of the budget process, on the Treasury's living standards framework and the four capitals within that framework. And our view was that, and you've heard this framed via a soundbite, which is the concept that the best economic approach to COVID-19 was always going to be a strong public health approach. I still believe that today, and I believe that our results have borne that out. But what that is, in fact, really is a manifestation of a wellbeing approach, of looking at a variety of factors within the economy, how they intersect with one another, and how we can make use of all of the tools in the government's toolbox to be able to support both lives and livelihoods. I operated on some pretty fundamental assumptions, and that was one of them. And as I say, I think the success of that has been borne out in the success of our economic recovery, because that strong public health response has enabled us to have extended periods of time in which the New Zealand economy has operated, relatively speaking, in a normal way. And I note, I think it's the Oxford University Stringency Index shows that we've had about the fourth least number of days in some form of lockdown of countries in the world. And that is the strength, is that yes, our elimination approach requires periods of shutdown when we have cases or cases that we can't trace. But what the payoff of that is extended periods when the economy is operating in a relatively normal way. So that wellbeing approach was very important to us. Underpinning that was also a view that, along with going hard and early against the virus, we needed to move in a similarly decisive way in terms of the economic support to back up that strong public health approach. In order to ensure that our strong stocks of social capital, our trust in institutions and each other, were being upheld, we had to deploy financial capital to the situation. And so that's what drove, for example, the wage subsidy scheme. We operated that scheme differently than similar schemes in other countries. We paid it out as a lump sum. We paid it out where you could predict your revenue loss rather than having to rely on the tax system, which is what the Australian government did. And I have a strong belief that using that approach, which we characterised as being about ensuring cash flow and confidence, has again been borne out in the statistics. So if we look at the wage subsidy scheme, its fundamental driver was to ensure attachment to employment remained, to give confidence to those businesses to keep people on and ensure that there weren't precipitous decisions made about laying people off. That's now seen us in a situation where unemployment has come in significantly lower than what was expected. We had predictions upwards of 15% unemployment. We've now ended up at around 4.9%. I think that'll go up and down a little bit over the next few months as one or two industries post-summer take another look at themselves, in particular tourism. But regardless, it's a significantly better outcome than had been predicted. And I think that approach of ensuring cash flow and confidence going hard and early, having other schemes as well as the wage subsidy scheme available, such as the small business cash flow loan scheme, the targeted packages we had in the tourism sector, and so on, has been absolutely critically important. So that's really, a major point I wanted to make, is that we've actually extended our wellbeing approach out as a way of dealing with and a framework for dealing with an unprecedented pandemic. That has left us in a relatively strong position when it comes to the economy. We obviously saw the big rebound in the September quarter, GDP up 14%. We were one of only 4 economies in the world to experience economic activity in the September quarter that was stronger than the same pre-COVID period. That's an extraordinary outturn. As I said, unemployment below 5%. Really strong performance underpinning all of that from the export sector. Little bit of softness in some of the January data on exports, but overall an extraordinary ability for that to be upheld. And again, the government worked alongside that sector. One of, I think, the unheralded aspects of the response to COVID has been our aviation support scheme. This is the scheme that's made sure that we do have air freight capacity coming in and out of New Zealand. We did run a risk that, even though we were propping Air New Zealand up with the support we were giving there, that other airlines would conclude that they didn't need to come to New Zealand anymore. We've provided an assurance that that will happen and paid for it. Exporters still have to pay for the actual freight that they put on the flight, but having that capacity there, I think, has been really important. Unfortunately, not as easy to do when it comes to sea freight, and the disruption in the supply chain there has been a real issue, I know, for particularly for importers, but also for some exporters as well. So, we feel we're in a very strong position there, and that's been most recently borne out in Standard & Poor's upgrading our credit ratings. So we're now in AAA for local currency. That's really good. And I think we as a whole country need to reflect on the fact that the reasoning Standard & Poor's gave is their confidence in the underlying fundamentals of our economy, but also in the response that has come forward from COVID. It's their first upgrade around the world since the pandemic began, and the first for New Zealand since 2011, getting us back to where we were in 2009. So that recovery is good. It has been uneven, and I think we obviously all understand that there are sectors in our economy that have been more affected, in particular tourism, events, the events sector that goes with that, international education. And so we continue to work with those sectors to be able to provide the support that we need. I don't want anyone to gain the impression that I think that we've been perfect here. We haven't. We've made mistakes, but what we've shown is that we can be adaptable and we can respond when we see those mistakes being made. And we've tried to take the approach throughout this of a least regrets approach, that we have to go and put money in or take a particular stance on the basis of the facts we have. If we get it wrong, then we have to move and adapt for that. And I think by and large, that approach has served us well, along with obviously listening to the scientific and expert advice. In terms of, so that's a skate across some sort of aspects of our approach that I think we can be proud of. In terms of where we're going in accelerating the economic recovery, I just want to highlight 2 or 3 points here. The first of those was a lesson that we learned from the global financial crisis, which was that when the time came for a recovery, we had real issues around skills and workforce. We simply didn't have the people that we needed to be able to drive that on. So we took a very clear decision as part of the May 2020 budget to put probably the biggest investment that New Zealand's ever seen into skills and training, and in particular apprenticeships. And that has seen a tremendous result. The latest numbers I have is that we've seen a 125% increase in people in apprenticeships since we made them free. In the construction industry, we've got massively larger number of apprenticeships there. And that gives us some confidence that we are meeting many of the labour force needs that are there as we get into recovery. We will not be able to meet all of them, however, from our domestic workforce. And one of the issues we now have to grapple with as a country coming out of COVID is, what does immigration policy look like in a post-COVID era? It will continue. Immigration will continue to be part of the New Zealand economic story. We will continue to want to bring people in where we have skill gaps to ensure that we can, create the high wage jobs we want and have the right people coming in to fill the right job. But the large scale inward migration that we've seen may not come back quickly, because there will be decisions being made by people overseas about where they want to be and how much they want to travel. But we also have to look at this as an opportunity to say, where in our economy can we be doing more to train New Zealanders to lift the value of the wages in particular sectors? And that's certainly something the government is turning its mind to as we speak. Otherwise, in terms of accelerating the recovery, obviously there's been a hugely significant investment from the government. I make no apologies for that. If you are saving for a rainy day, and successive governments have done that, then when it starts raining, you must put the umbrella up, and that's what we've done. The spending that we've allocated has gone right across the economy, from basic social supports and increasing those all the way through to significant investment in all parts of the productive economy, making sure that we're doing the right thing with around $40 billion worth of infrastructure investment coming through over the next few years, everything from housing and transport to trying to get on top of some of the big challenges I'll finish on in a moment. And so that heavy investment is, I believe, the right thing to do, but obviously it has consequences. And I think one of the really important things to remember in thinking about COVID is that there are no costless decisions. We could have made decisions to spend less that would have had costs in other parts of our society. We could have made decisions to not adopt an elimination strategy that would have had significant impacts in terms of health outcomes. So all decisions have a cost, and there is a significant financial cost to the one we have made. What I believe is that our way out from this continues to be to grow the economy productively. We've clearly had strong support from monetary policy alongside our fiscal policy strategy, but I also accept that as time wears on, we need to be returning ourselves to a more balanced fiscal position. What I would say is that won't happen quickly. And the numbers that we've seen coming through both the half-yearly update and around the time of the budget policy statement earlier this year indicate that New Zealanders will see higher levels of government debt than we have in the past. But the signs are good for that coming down significantly quicker than what we had initially both forecasted and projected. So we will still peak up, according to the forecasts, in the high 40% of net core crown debt of GDP, but then that starts to come down, and by the end of the projection period, the 10-year projection period, we're back down into the mid-30s. To me, that is responsible. It will still see New Zealand sit among the least indebted countries in the world, but I'm not prepared to go down the path of austerity that would be required to bring those levels of debt down to that 19-20% level that we saw before COVID-19. We will get there. We will bring ourselves back to a more stable position over time, but I'm not prepared to sacrifice the things that we need to do in the economy on the way through there. New Zealand is in a strong position to borrow, and one of the really interesting aspects of the cost of borrowing is that today, even even with the extraordinary sums of money that we've borrowed over the last year, our debt servicing costs are similar to what they were in 2016 when we were borrowing a lot less. So the low interest rate environment has been good for us in that way, but an important part of acknowledging that we can handle the debt we have. And again, Standard & Poor's and others have recognised that. And then my final set of comments I wanted to make by way of introduction are about those longer term challenges in the New Zealand economy, some of which have been exacerbated by COVID-19 and brought into more sharp relief, and others of which we simply have to carry on working on. When I think about, and I know you've already had Ganesh Nana on today, when I think about the productivity challenges that New Zealand faces, those have been brought into more sharp relief during this period of time. It is vitally important for us that we continue to ensure that the industries that have done as well through COVID are both supported and moved forward further into the 21st century. And there's some really good work that's been done in things like the Fit for a Better World strategy around sustainable agriculture, the industry transformation plans that we've been working on, both in areas like agri-tech and the one in the digital sector that's underway at the moment. And I just think we all recognise that in COVID-19 has shown to us we need resilience, we need diversity of product, we need diversity of market, and we've got to make sure that those things are front and centre. We've put significant resources into NZTE and elsewhere to help us along that journey. The other big issues that are in front of the government at the moment, housing, we all know well, is a very long-term challenge. But again, COVID-19 has shown the difficulties of working on this sector. All economists from the retail banks and from the government institutions were predicting drops in house prices, quite significant drops in house prices through 2020. The opposite occurred. We're now in the process of working through our response to that, but it's quite clear that that housing challenge remains massive for us. It is a supply and a demand challenge, and one that will occupy the time of this government and governments to come for some time. In an area like climate change, we've got a massive opportunity in my view. I actually think the Independent Climate Commission report is probably one of the most significant documents of my political lifetime. And as a government, we are very seized of the need to get ahead of that challenge, to make sure that we do have the carbon budgets in the areas like transport, industrial heat, electricity generation, that shows that we can genuinely meet those goals, but then also seize that opportunity that exists for New Zealand to lead in the technological development around climate change and to lead the world in the way that we adapt our industries to be able to be sustainable going forward. So that is a massive challenge for us as well. And then finally, in the area of child wellbeing, where again, COVID-19 has highlighted recessions will always have a disproportionate impact on those who are in lowest income communities and groups that are already marginalised. So our focus, our evidence-based focus when we put together our objectives for the budget have to be able to address those issues. We've made a number of short-term measures through COVID to deal with that, but the long-term importance of reducing rates of child poverty in our country are critical. Good signs in the latest numbers that we've seen that the families package we brought in when we first came into government is having some effect, but no doubt a long way to go. So that just highlights that New Zealand economy has a number of existing challenges, all of which are on our plate while we continue to keep New Zealanders safe from COVID-19. Those three things, keeping New Zealand safe from COVID-19, accelerating our economic recovery, and dealing with the big challenges are the priorities that are on our plate this term. So with that, Matt, I'll leave my comments and take questions.
Thank you. All right, a lot to discuss, and I'm sure that everybody would have questions for the Deputy Prime Minister that would go for hours. I'll start with one that's been bubbling away. Obviously, having been very successful in an elimination strategy, we're now in a different situation to much of the rest of the world. We're looking at vaccine rollouts, we're looking at other countries that may have maybe moved through some immunity from people who have had the virus and recovered. What is your thinking about how we reconnect to the world? As other countries may, by and large, go back to a version of normal, people can trade, people can gather, due to a mix of vaccination and immunity. At a point where we're in elimination land, how do we go and transition from that to reconnect and, I guess, stop being such an island as we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a few thoughts in response to that. The first is, I think we need to be careful not to buy into the idea that we've become completely isolated from the world. We haven't. The thing we're missing is the ability to personally travel. But as I mentioned before, we have had tremendous performance from our export sector over this period of time, and we've continued to make sure that it happens, and that trade will continue and will I hope grow and be enhanced. And so I do think it's really important that we don't overdo this fact that there are issues around the border and a very particular sector, international tourism, that's affected by that, and then events and international aid to an extent. So I just want to make that as my caveat to the question. I think it's easy to draw this in a black and white way that I don't think is that accurate. Second point is, we're not going to stand still waiting just for the whole population to be vaccinated. Everyone's well aware of the fact that we're continuing to work on the Australian travel bubble, work on how we can ensure we can get travel within the Pacific to the extent that those nations in the Pacific are keen on it. And so I think, that process continues while we work to vaccinate the whole population. And then my third point would be, we have managed to operate. The elimination strategy gives us the ability to operate in a very normal way here in New Zealand when we are at level 1. And that strategy, I think, has served us well. As other countries start to get themselves in a position to be more like we have been over time, that will only enhance the economic activity in those countries and allow us to be able to sell into those countries and get the benefit of our exports. But, the strategy has served us well. The vaccination campaign has begun. We'll be in a strong position to have vaccinated all New Zealanders before the end of this year. It'll be interesting to see where other countries get to on that, and then their confidence to start moving around the world themselves.
A question that came through from the audience: the cost of COVID response has been one of the largest in the OECD in terms of output forgone and increased debt. You referenced yourself the fact that there are no costless decisions. How is the government going through that decision-making process? How much is too much? How much is enough? And how are you going through those policy decisions to make those trade-offs?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the bread and butter of government in normal times anyway, is the trade-off of what you do there. From our perspective, I've tried to say this from the beginning, that these funds we've created are envelopes, not targets, and so we don't have to spend every dollar that's sitting in the envelope. And we, as everybody knows, kept money back within the COVID fund for the possibility of resurgences, and here we find ourselves today in that position. So we're carefully judging that. The other piece of work that I've been doing, which is we've put alongside the budget process, is going back over each item of spending within the COVID relief fund and assessing whether the money has been spent, is it still needed, can it be reprioritised? And so we're in the midst of that exercise now. And I know you've got Adrian with you tomorrow morning, and one of the things also to think about with the Reserve Bank is that while they had the facility in the large-scale asset purchase program to purchase $100 billion worth of bonds, only about 45 billion, I think, has actually been purchased. So again, it's about calibrating the response to where we are. I recognise that it's a large response, but I, again, will defend that, because I think that when you look at unemployment, when you look at the return we've had in terms of GDP, we're coming back well. But yes, in the initial period of time, it's a large response, but I think it will still believe it was the appropriate one.
Thank you. One a bit nearer to home, I'm standing on the stage of a great facility in a university, and a question that came through was acknowledging the great increase in people going into trades. What's your position on significant financial challenges and losses in the university sector, international education?
Yeah, and as I mentioned a couple of times, I absolutely recognise that international education is a sector that's been affected. We've tried to keep the window open, or the pipeline open, with a modest number of students coming back through the system for this academic year. I guess my message to the university sector is that this is going to be a challenging year in 2021, but I think 2022 is a year that will be very strong for, potentially anyway, for that international education sector. Universities do have balance sheets. and they can be looked at, and they should be looked at. But then I think my second message is that it is also, and I hate to trigger Peter Williams or anything with the use of the word reset, but it is an opportunity for universities to take a look at the mix of their funding sources. And we've just been talking, I was talking before, and I think other speakers earlier today have talked about the huge importance of diversification in our overall portfolio. The same exists for universities. And, in fairness to the university sector, they were directed via the previous national government's tertiary education strategy towards a greater reliance on international students. I think now we have to start thinking a little bit more about a bit more resilience being built into that. There's one tertiary institution in New Zealand who took their own decision a couple of years ago to not be quite so reliant, and certainly to look at even the mix within international students that they have. And I think my view is that is a very important conversation. And then thirdly, and I've had this raised by a number of tertiary institutions, just a conversation about partnerships with the government around some of the longer term capital expenditure that's out there. We were able to do that with the University of Auckland with one part of the infrastructure reference group funding, and I recognise that there's some good conversations to have about that. But I think my main piece of advice is, as a business, a university needs to have a think about 2021 being a challenging year, but 2022 and beyond looking quite good.
Thank you. Another one, I guess a lot of things come down to border issues at the moment. Questions about migration. So there's a point made that international evidence strongly suggests migration is good for growing the income of locals as well as others. What's your view on the right level of migration for New Zealand? And do you see New Zealand being different? Is there any evidence for New Zealand being different in terms of that international evidence of migration generally being wealth accretive?
Oh, there's no doubt that the economic modelers, Treasury and elsewhere will say that on a net level, immigration is a positive for the economy. The real question for us is the scale and the mix of that. And as I said in my earlier comments, what we now want to do is take a look at our immigration settings to make sure that our focus genuinely is on filling skill gaps and ways in which we lift productivity. And credit back to the previous national government and then our term as well. We've gone through and made some changes to settings where we weren't quite getting that balance right. There was a system where you were able to extend your visa on the basis of your tertiary course for the length of time of your tertiary course, which would then open up the ability for you to be here long enough to get residence and so forth and so on. And we saw some exploitation of that, which, as I say, both governments have cracked down on. We want to continue to look at the settings so we really are getting ourselves in a position where that mix of immigration is about lifting productivity, lifting the value of what we do. What does that mean for exact numbers in the future? That's the piece of work that I think I heard Minister Farfoy in the media the other day talking about that we now need to do. It's a complex picture, Matt. Right now, we've got a number of sort of working holiday visa holders and others who've stayed in New Zealand for a variety of different reasons, who are actually quite important to making sure that we manage to do some of the things we need to do over the next few months in the horticulture sector and elsewhere. And so, it's never as clean and clear cut as you might like it to be. The regional seasonal employer program with people coming in from the Pacific, very important to Pacific economies as well as our own. So we're trying to get the balance of that right. So immigration, I wish, was a clear cut thing where you could say this number over this time. But I think what we've got to do is just make sure we go back and get the settings right. And then my final point would be the one again I made before, which is that we also know that alongside that important role immigration plays in our productive economy, it's also been used in some sectors to suppress wages. And we want to be able to work through that, lift the wages in those sectors, have more New Zealanders going into that. That's a transitional situation in many of those industries, but it's one that we do need to work through.
Right. All right, I'll just check if there's a last question from the floor in the room here in the Galera Academy. No. All right, we'll wrap up. Again, Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much. We are imagining what else is on your schedule today, and it's dealing with the questions you've just been asked here. So we genuinely appreciate you taking the time to join us, hopefully next time in person, and good luck. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks very much.